in a way, the evolution of the extremist landscape has been one in which we see increasingly the risk of violence, the threat of violence coming not just from ostensibly violent groups, the justification coming from mainstream politicians or influencers is important in the radicalization of those outside those groups, and that's something that we've seen more and more of, and amazing because even in the most like extreme context of violent, extreme, and neo-Nazi type environments, you see more and more content being shared from the mainstream.
Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum. We range from center-left to center-right. I'm Mona Charan, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark, and I'm joined by two of our regulars, Damon Linker, who writes the Substack newsletter Notes from the Middle Ground, and Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center. Bill Galston is traveling this week. Sitting in for him is Philip Bump, columnist at the Washington Post. Our special guest this week is Sasha Havlicek. Sasha is co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which focuses on global initiatives to counter the rise of weaponized hate, disinformation, and extremism, both online and offline. So thanks one and all. We are recording this on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. There have been some amazingly moving moments that have been captured from the ceremonies today. And so before we plunge into everything else, I just wanted to express, and I'm sure I speak for all of us, our eternal gratitude for the people who gave their lives and who fought there and died there. It made the world we enjoy possible. So, Sasha, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to give us the lay of the land in terms of what kinds of threats we're facing vis-a-vis election disinformation in 2024. I know you focus on a lot of different kinds of online disinformation, but specifically regarding the election in the U.S., what are we currently dealing with? Who are the big actors? So give us the lay of the land, if you would.
Mona, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for having me on. It feels like a particularly poignant day to be talking about threats to democracy. But I was struck by the comments made by your leader of the Senate Intelligence Committee just a couple of days ago. Mark Warner said that the US may be more vulnerable to foreign disinformation aimed at influencing voters and undermining democracy here than it was in 2020. And I would agree with that analysis. And maybe just to lay out why. You've asked about the actors. Well, number one, there are multiple foreign actors with a stake in these elections, and their toolkit has expanded. And I would say that they are perhaps more motivated than ever before. Russia, Iran, and China remain the most sophisticated in terms of their ability to attack from a cyber and information threat standpoint. And just in our own analysis, we've been monitoring influence operations driven by all three of those, specifically targeting the US and the elections in the past months. And I think it bears mentioning that for the Kremlin, this is existential. They're motivated more than ever, of course, to see a change in policy on Ukraine. But we're seeing a much more front-footed set of activities by both CCP and Iranian information operatives. Chinese information operations were largely defensive before. They've become much more Kremlin-like, much more aggressive, much more likely to exploit racial and other types of political divides in the US. And they've started to test infiltration tactics. Some of our research has shown that they've been setting up fake profiles and groups impersonating Americans. This sort of so-called spamouflage network has been growing. They're increasingly, like the Russians, using AI to do that, using new short-form media. They're getting into sort of environments to get at young people. And then the Iranian piece, I think, is important because what we see with the Islamic Republic's digital ecosystem is its ability to hack into systems linked to critical infrastructure in the US. They do that with a series of proxy groups that also support Kremlin interests. So we see this sort of confluence of hacktivist networks that have been fairly successful at hacking into both public and private infrastructure. And I would say that some of these have experience from Ukraine, on hacking into digital infrastructure and leaking information the way that we've seen in the past the Kremlin do. And I think we may be experiencing more of over the coming months. But I think the most important things maybe to remember is that we've seen an emerging confluence of these actors. They are, if not acting in coordination, they're certainly reinforcing each other's activities, narratives. And so there's this sort of confluence that we worry about. And they're targeting both hard left and hard right constituencies. In particular, after October 7th, you've got sort of specific narratives being pushed about the bankruptcy of the West and, the genocide going on, the complicity of Western governments in the US in that context. And of course, I think we shouldn't forget that we're seeing a rise in Islamist mobilization, Islamist extremist mobilization in many parts of the world. They are going to be targeting Western targets increasingly. And perhaps the most challenging part of this is that the hostile state piece of the landscape increasingly piggybacks off domestic networks, domestic conspiracy and extremist networks. They don't really need to produce their own content as much as they amplify what already, of course, is being spread by those types of networks. And often it makes them, difficult to track, sort of indistinguishable to some extent, interwoven with domestic content in a way that makes that very hard to address, because then you get into the terrain of domestic political speech. And in the climate that we're currently operating in, where there are campaigns coming at the disinformation research sector and government and platforms for doing anything about this kind of problem, that becomes a real problem. And I think we really need to look at social media as one of the actors in this space. And it isn't just that, they failed to enforce their own policies on hate and extremism and disinformation, and that they algorithmically amplify the content that comes closest to the red line in relation to those policies. But what we've now also seen in the recent period is that they've been laying off their content moderators. YouTube reversed its policy prohibiting 2020 sort of election fraud claims, sort of debunked claims. Meta's done sort of similar things, allowing political advertisements that around, 2020 being rigged. And to sort of add insult to injury there, we've seen the shuttering of data access for researchers on social media platforms. So we are less able to do the monitoring and to identify these types of hostile activities than ever before. Unlike in Europe, where you're seeing the opposite trend happen because you've got now a major piece of legislation coming into place on social media that really is enabling the research sector, we hope now more comprehensively, to get at that data. So yes, we're more vulnerable than ever. And I think it's important at some point to talk about what this really means. I think we tend to think about it as just a bit of nasty stuff or untrue things being said. And I will say, what happens online doesn't automatically track into the offline universe, and it doesn't necessarily translate into opinions being changed. And it's important to keep this into some, in some context. But the tactics that we're seeing used, can result in very dangerous things happening. And we see swatting and, hoax bomb threats and intimidation and harassment and threats of violence and so on, disruption of election infrastructure and so on, all side by side with this. So there's real danger involved here.
Thank you for that. I'd like to drill down a little bit on this notion that because of our polarization, we are putting manacles on our own capacity to respond to these kinds of foreign influence threats. So, for example, we have seen moves by Republicans to, subpoena researchers who are doing, research on foreign influence operations. We have seen lawsuits. One is now before the Supreme Court, suggesting that when the U.S. government cooperates or even alerts media companies to intelligence operations that this is actually a conspiracy against certain kinds of free speech. And without necessarily debunking all of that, because there may be kernels of truth in, and there may be arguments for, being very careful about the way government responds to these things. I would be curious to hear you talk about the effect of these sort of this mobilization to prevent anybody from taking action against foreign agents of influence.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's become an extremely hostile environment for research in this space, which is interesting and extremely challenging. I'd say there are all sorts of good reasons to limit the ways in which government can either access data or put influence, sort of influence, if you like, the decisions of social media platforms, which is not to say that we shouldn't be regulating this space. Independent regulation, I think, is critically important to get to. The kind of regulation that isn't about, a sort of whack-a-mole approach to individual pieces of speech content, but really looks at the ways in which these algorithmic systems, the technological infrastructure of these platforms, inorganically amplifies the kinds of activities that can become extremely dangerous. I think that is essentially the approach that the European governments have taken and the EU is taking. But I would say this: I think the entire framing is wrong. We currently do not operate in a free speech environment. You see something very different to what I see in my feeds, and the attention economy, the business model of these social media platforms, essentially they imbibe your data. And they target constituencies, often the most vulnerable constituencies, with some of the most potentially dangerous content. And we're seeing, I've got a lot of research that I can share on how that can happen, and that sort of drive into rabbit holes and sort of, the kind of polarization dynamic that's happened at scale online is because of that social media model and that engagement model, engagement over safety. And
right.
We make money off that. And I think, we have to understand that's a curated speech environment. The question is, can we level the playing field for speech? Can we get to a place where we level the playing field for speech? And while authoritarian countries respond with censorship, so hard controls and censorship around content, our response needs to be, I think, mandated transparency, which is to say research and access to data on the platform so that we can at scale understand the impact of these platforms on these types of harms in our society today, and then decide on the basis of real data what to do about that. And I think that's what's missing right now. Nobody has access to that data.
Can I? Yes. One of the things that just a personal frustration of mine is that, I'm on Threads or I still look at X, and it is impossible to curate it for myself and say, I just want to see what's trending for the whole world or for all of the United States. No, I can only see what they want me to see. And so that is very frustrating because as a journalist, I just want to get a sense of what are people responding to? What are people talking about? What's trending? What's important? And it gets harder and harder to get that.
That's right. And this is also a question of user choice. There should be better user choice, not to mention the fact that the terms and conditions that you sign up to on these platforms as a user are not being met by the platforms themselves. Adherence to the rules that they set has to be part of the deal when you sign up. So again, you go on expecting a certain environment and you get something else. I think that it is really, really important to build better transparency into these systems for the public and for policymakers and others to be able to make some real decisions about what we do about the kinds of harms I think that everybody basically feels, aggrieved by today in society. I don't think this is, when you look at polls, people know that there are problems with the way in which this information ecosystem works, and they understand that it's distorted in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the panel. If anybody else has something that they would like to ask.
I'll just note that it's pretty remarkable. I mean, the watching the transition from 2016 through now, 2016, the response to the efforts by Russia and the ways in which all of the vitriol, met with a response from Twitter and Facebook and so on and so forth, to now having that backlash, which was just discussed. But moreover, and I think that the real challenge to a lot of what you just said is, Twitter's private, right? That Elon Musk buys into these allegations, bought the company, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? I mean, yes, you can have regulatory action, but that's not going to pass the Republican-led House, right? The Republicans have led the charge on trying to scale back some of this to foster this environment of misinformation. So all of this discussion is limited in this really bizarre way, in this really bizarre instance, which happens to be one of the most significant instances in terms of sharing news. What is there anything that can be done about that?
I think that there's a lot that we can do, and I think coming at this both from a sort of supply and demand perspective, I will say, number one, we have to understand that this is a national security issue. This is a national set of national security threats that the US is now disproportionately vulnerable to, where there is something of a roadmap coming forward out of sort of other contexts as to how to deal with this without infringing on free speech, which is important to all of us. In fact, I think, it's disingenuous because this entire engagement, this, the subpoenaing of research organizations, ultimately attacks their First Amendment rights to research and publish findings about what is happening in the public domain. This is publicly available sort of data. And again, we're not talking about sharing the super special secret source of, the kind of, the algorithms themselves. We're talking about being able to evaluate the impact of these things, which we do in other sectors. And every other sector, really has some form of regulation in place. But I will say low-hanging fruit would be pressure on platforms to provide the kind of data access needed for the research sector to be able to flag to the public, put into the public domain, the ways in which specific types of bad actors may be, seeking to manipulate them. This is inauthentic coordinated behavior, these kinds of, activities that really are intended and designed to deceive, that kind of thing, by by bad actors that could result in everything from, attacks, like violent attacks on election officials, on poll workers, on election infrastructure, on IT infrastructure and systems, on voting systems, on, everything that we've seen, storage facilities, polling places and drop boxes and voters. I mean, this is critically important to get around. So I think there's that basic data access and transparency. And then we've got to do pre-bunking better, get out there to the public with what is happening, what these, foreign actors, for instance, are trying to do and how they're doing it. And I believe that there's a huge amount we can be doing to build resilience across society. So we do a lot of work with providing these types of insights to the front line, law enforcement, state and election officials, local media, local influencers, cities. We do a lot of work with cities. I mean, the National League of Cities has talked about how much threat their constituencies are coming under because of this online world. They have a stake in this. And so getting that information out there into that, down to the local level, and then building strategies to respond for those constituencies is incredibly important and doable. And there's a kind of digital hygiene requirement. We always think about digital literacy for kids, but adults are really the problem in relation to the election, dynamics that, we need to build better digital literacy for adults, even just.
So Sasha, can I interrupt right on that point? Because I can anticipate that viewers are going to be asking, what can I personally do to assure that when I'm online, I'm not being deceived? What are some tools that the average information consumer can use to avoid this kind of disinformation that's so prevalent?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of things that, people can do, users can do. I mean, one is actually just informing yourselves of the policies on each of the platforms that you might be using, because you need to know, do they have a policy in place in relation to disinformation? Is a piece of disinformation or hostile state actor information going to be labeled, for instance, for you or not? Know where you are in terms of the online ecosystem of platforms. Think just friction. Think before you share. Don't share stuff. Especially if you think it may be problematic. We have a tendency to share things that we think, oh my gosh, is this real? And that gains the algorithms into promoting that kind of content, even if we think it's bad. It reacts to both positive and negative engagements. So we've got to be careful about how we behave with content. I think that there's a whole range of really basic tools out there for people, for instance, to check provenance of certain types of content and images and so on. It's a little bit more technical, but it's the kind of thing that I think we could be educating adults through, for instance, their employers. I think there's a role for businesses and employers to play in just basic digital literacy training for people in terms of information, in the same way that they might be doing that in relation to cyber attacks. And so we've worked, for instance, with companies through a big program in Germany called the Business Council for Democracy, where business, with business partners, we're helping to bring that kind of basic training into the workplace, which is a trusted environment still. It's still an environment that people don't think is trying to deceive them, and where they can have real conversations with real people about what that means. I would love to see businesses take a role of that kind in the United States.
All right. Well, thank you. That is a good start. It's a very fraught time, and some of your solutions are more long term. But at least in the short run, people can be careful about what they share. If you're not sure it's right, don't share it. And see if you can check the provenance of certain things, because I know I've been fooled. Luckily I have a slow trigger finger. And so, I've narrowly escaped the trap of retweeting or, circulating something only to find out later, that it was a fake or it was a spoof, and of course these days it's very hard to tell the difference between but anyway, all right. Well, thank you so much for that. Let us, before we turn to our next topic, talk a little bit about Miracle Made. Did you know that your temperature at night can have one of the greatest impacts on your sleep quality? If you wake up too hot or too cold, I highly recommend you check out Miracle Made's bed sheets. Inspired by NASA, Miracle Made uses silver-infused fabrics and makes temperature-regulating bedding, so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. These have silver-infused fabrics inspired by NASA. They are thermoregulating and designed to keep you at the perfect temperature all night long. They're also self-cleaning because they are infused with silver, and that prevents 99.7% of bacterial growth. Miracle Made sheets are also luxuriously comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands, and feel as nice, if not nicer, than sheets used by some 5-star hotels. So go to trymiracle.com/beg-to-differ to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo, Beg to Differ, at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you will get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/beg-to-differ and use that code BEG-to-differ to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/beg-to-differ. And we thank them for sponsoring this podcast. All right. Since we last met, we have had a verdict in Trump's New York trial, 34 counts guilty. And it has led to quite the reaction from MAGA world. So first, I'd like though. So let's touch on the reaction of the Republicans, and then I'd like to get to Biden's reaction and what should Biden do about this. Some people are saying he needs to, make it part of his stump speech and really hit Trump with it. Others are not so sure. But let's take a little stroll through the MAGA world's reaction. So here's the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh. He said, Donald Trump should make and publish a list of 10 high-ranking Democrat criminals who he will have arrested when he takes office. First on the list should be Joe Biden. John Yoo, former Bush administration lawyer, who wrote the famous legal justifications for torture during the Iraq War, writes in National Review that Republicans will have to bring charges against Democratic officers, even presidents. Mike Collins, congressman from Georgia, said, well, anyway, it goes on and on. I will say that the most over the top and outrageous thing that I saw there were two. The first one was from Con Carroll, who is a writer at the Washington Examiner, who said that he did not vote for Trump in 2016 or 2020. But now that he is a convicted felon, Carroll will crawl over broken glass to vote for him. So there's that. But then there has been a whole theme online of people comparing Trump to Alexei Navalny, to Solzhenitsyn, and of course to Jesus. And this is the one that was my favorite. Can you vote for a convicted felon? And then an image of Jesus. Remember that you worship one. Wow. Actually, Philip, the MAGA people worship Donald Trump as a godlike figure, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a personality. I will say that I saw a lot more of the Jesus than the Solzhenitsyn, which I think is probably to be expected. But I mean, this idea that the facts of the case don't matter, that this, while I think that it is absolutely valid to wonder why Trump was the target of this particular prosecution, given the involvement of others in the Trump organization in this effort, it still remains the case that there was this hush money payment made shortly before the 2016 election, obviously to influence the election, which was then covered up by Trump organization documents. Right, like the facts of the case and Trump's culpability for it are very obvious in an objective standpoint. But Trump has done such a good job, again, going back to talking about 2016 and the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election, in which he instantaneously, as soon as the stories about Russian interference came out, he started spinning this as the deep state trying to get him, and as federal law enforcement and the intelligence community trying to get him. And he inoculated, his most successful vaccination effort was in getting his base of support to feel as though any criminal charges or any investigation into him was invalid. And he's been really, really good at that, right? To the detriment of American politics. But he's been really, really good at that. And so when this came around, this was the case about which Americans had the most skepticism, which is somewhat unfortunate in terms of, presenting to the American public something that they are going to consider very seriously. Although even if this had been the documents case, when we see the response to the documents case, the guy has classified documents. Here's a picture of them on the floor in Mar-a-Lago taken out of his desk, right? It's not an accident that they were there. And they're like, it's a setup, it's a witch hunt, right? What do you do with that? And the answer is nothing. And so what we get is this sort of response, which is they're all out to get him. Trump's super leaning into that, right? In 2016, he was like, I'm going to tackle the big state. In 2020, he's like, I am the source of power. Now he's like, they're all out to get me. It's a victimization campaign. This plays into that. And he did, he spent 8 years setting it up.
Yeah. Damon, I am one of those who is skeptical of this case. I didn't like it. I thought it was jerry-rigged. I thought, the elevation of a document falsification, internal matter in the Trump organization into a so-called felony. I thought it was weak and I didn't like it. But I do agree with Philip Bump that if this had been the documents case, if this had been the January 6th case, all of the Trump defenders wouldn't be saying anything different. They wouldn't say, oh, well, now here you do have a good case. I'll grant you he did something wrong here. They have become so inured to reality, to truth. They don't care. And so and further, one other point I'd like you to respond to, which is, one of the arguments they make is, and it has some surface plausibility. They say, look, nobody else would have been brought to trial on these charges in New York if they hadn't been Trump. So it was trying to pin something on him, which may be right, actually, in this case. But the fact is, he has been treated better than any other defendant in almost every other instance. Even in this case, where he was found in contempt by the judge 10 times. Nobody else would have been kept out of prison in those conditions except Trump. So he has benefited so much from the law leaning over backwards, not to hold him to the same standards as everybody else. In the case of the documents, asking, pretty please, will you return them? Can we come to some understanding? And he kept stiff arming the Department of Justice and the FBI and so on, even in the face of a subpoena. So my question, for me, it's hard to get angry and resentful that the New York case was an overreach when so many other times he's been treated better. Rough justice?
Well, I mean, everything about Trump's everything is sui generis. I mean, this is what's so bizarre and hilarious in a dark way when you hear Republicans responding to this conviction by saying, oh, well, if they can do this to him, they'll do it to you next. And to which my response is, that's right. The next time I'm running for president and try
and stooping a porn star. Yes.
On my third wife who's just given birth. And then I want to conceal it for the election. And then I order my fixer to conceal it and to rig the bookkeeping entries. Like, the whole thing is so distinct to just this guy and his particular, we'll call them fallible tendencies of character. And then the fact that he was running for president and then became president and now is running again for president. Like, this is something that, they say, bad cases or tough cases, extreme cases make bad law. I mean, everything about Trump is an outlier. So I don't know how generalizable any of it is. And that even includes across the different cases. And I do think that it's important, as tempting as it is to kind of read this reaction to what the reaction would be if this had been the documents case. And I don't deny, of course, the Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, 110%, and then most other office-holding Republicans in the high double-digit percent would have said precisely the same thing in the case of a conviction in that far graver and more legally rigorous case. So that's just a given at this point, and that's one of the reasons why I've sort of shivered a little bit every time I've contemplated all of these cases, because in a weird way, I think it's better that this case appears to be relatively trivial as opposed to some of the others, because if you start to have half of the country in partisan terms, roughly equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, and you have senior office holders of the Republican Party, half of the political system coming out and saying, in effect, yeah, this attempt to hold Trump to basic expectations for law-abidingness of how to deal with classified documents, what you end up with, in effect, is a deep corruption of the understanding of the rule of law and our polity, which is very bad for the medium and long term of this country, long after Trump is gone. And so I've said a lot on the podcast as I've vented my skepticism and apprehension about these cases. of precisely this fear of corrosion of the rule of law. But the interesting thing that maybe I should have, foreseen, but to actually live through the last week and see how it's played out, of course, the reality is it's not that Republicans stand up and say, yes, Trump was convicted according to the rule of law, but we Republicans don't want rule of law anymore, do we? No rule of law, down with rule of law. We want our great leader, the authoritarian dictator who can do anything he wants. No, of course, what they say is it's Biden and the Democrats and these prosecutors who are sullying the rule of law. We, the Republicans, want true rule of law. That's why Con Carroll said his absolutely ridiculous thing that you mentioned, which I had a field day on Twitter in the last week. Like, oh, Hunter Biden's on trial now. I've never liked Hunter Biden, but if he's convicted of a felony, then I'm going to crawl over broken glass to vote for that guy. I want him to be president. Like, who thinks that way? Anyway, my point is simply that the corrosion ends up being, at least as much as anything, a new reality where we in effect have, along with all of our other deep ideological and partisan divisions, effectively two understandings of the rule of law, which is the prelude to, I don't know if it'll manifest itself as a literal civil war, but it is not good when one party thinks the rule of law is, or says the rule of law is one thing, and the other party says it's this other thing. And so you kind of have this battle over supposedly high-minded principle where one of them is in effect just an attempt to defend dear leader against these legal charges in the name of defending the rule of law. It's unconscionable and very distressing. And in that respect, I am almost grateful that the trial and this case was not that grave. It doesn't appear to have affected the polls that much. It probably will wash out in the end. And we know there won't be any other trials going, at least completed by November 5th. And so now we can just do what we've all been dreading, which is doing politics, trying to defeat Trump and hoping against hope that Biden can do it that old-fashioned way.
Yep. Sasha, you wanted in on this.
Now, I was just going to say, we've been trying to analyze and measure the online reaction to the verdict and quantify somehow, in relation to other events that have happened. So we've analyzed hundreds of calls for violence. We worry about this from a violent extremism standpoint, of fantasies about the violent overthrow of the government. And when looking at keywords specifically related to violence or the promotion of unrest, we found that the sort of volume of activity across both fringe and mainstream platforms parallels the volume of that during after the Mar-a-Lago raid. And we worry because there's been a significant uptick in credible threats of violence this last week. And the new, in a way, the evolution of the extremist landscape has been one in which we see increasingly the risk of violence, the threat of violence, coming not just from ostensibly violent groups that are being monitored by law enforcement and so on, but from this wider ecosystem of conspiracy networks online, and the sort of lone actor inspired violence is very common in this context. And the justification coming from mainstream politicians or influencers is important in the radicalization of those outside of those groups, and that's something that we've seen more and more of, and amazing because even in the most extreme contexts of violent, extreme, and neo-Nazi type environments, you see more and more content being shared from the mainstream.
Yeah, that says a lot about us. That the mainstream has become a fertile laboratory for the extremists rather than the other way around. Amazing, Linda. There is another trial, though, going on just this week. And it is very interesting that there's been very little comment on it from the Republicans. I mean, this is a trial of Hunter Biden. It is highly embarrassing to the entire Biden family. It is lurid. And yet the Republicans have been awfully quiet about it because it does underline the point that the Department of Justice, well, of course, the New York case was a state case and not federal, but still, that the justice system is being quite even-handed here, taking a Republican and then a Democrat, prominent Democrat, to trial back to back. And they don't want to acknowledge that.
And by the way, it's not just Hunter Biden who is on trial this week, who's been indicted by a Democrat appointed attorney.
Oh, that's right.
Robert Menendez
yes,
is having
Senator
his day in
Menendez,
court.
yes.
And Henry Cuellar is not yet in court, but he is also another Democrat official, member of Congress, who's been indicted by the Justice Department. So it's this idea that there are two systems of justice. It's just ludicrous. And it really, I don't know. I've been very quiet so far on the show. And part of it is, I think I was so depressed, Sasha, by your comments on social media. And I'm a little protected from social media because I don't spend much time on social media at all. I used to look at Twitter back when it was a decent source of news, when I could get information on things that are happening in other cities or in other countries that weren't necessarily being covered yet by mainstream sources. But that's no longer the case. I mean, I have a X account, but as Mona suggested, and as you suggested, something about the algorithms affecting me don't put the kinds of things that I might be interested in my feed. And so I don't see the kinds of things I used to go to Twitter for example. But, you know, I do think it's important. And Mona, I want to get back to the question you started with about whether or not the Biden campaign and Biden himself are handling this well, the reaction to this. And I think it was really unfortunate that Biden gave a perfectly good press conference in which he commented on the trial. I thought that was appropriate. Then as he was walking off stage, somebody shouted a question to him and about whether or not I think he should be jailed. I can't remember what the question is now. All I remember was the silly grin.
Oh, it was Trump saying he was a political prisoner. He was
Trump saying he was a political. Okay, so he had this ridiculous grin on his face, and he stood there for way too long with, you know, I won't use the term that we usually use to describe those kinds of grins.
We know what you mean.
You know exactly what I'm referring to, and it really is too bad because I think. I don't agree with those who say that Biden should be out there every day referring to Trump as a felon, having been convicted, etc. He doesn't need to do that. He needs to be out there telling people why they should elect him and why he is, you know, forward-looking and what he's going to do for the country. And, you know, I was one who, I mean, I have my son recorded me when the verdict came in. I didn't post it to my X account, but I was literally jumping up and down. I was very, very pleased that he got convicted because it's the first time in his life he's ever been held accountable for anything. But I don't think that's going to sway a whole lot of voters. I wish I believed that if the documents case or the case on the January 6th, I don't know what to call it, riot, secession.
Attempted
coup, that if verdicts had been handed down in those cases, that it might have had an effect, or if even the trials were to start. But as you rightly noted, there are not going to be any other trials. There may be if the Supreme Court in the next week or two decides to hand down a decision on the immunity issue and puts it back to the district court. There might be some hearings. There might be some questions that the district court will be asked to decide that would get at least some hearings into the public record. But as of now, This election is not going to be decided on that basis. It may be decided on whether or not Trump is unfit. I hope that's what it's decided on. But more and more, I think that the Biden campaign has got to do a better job making its case to the American public about why another 4 years of the Biden administration will be good for America.
Phil, there are two risks, it seems to me, of Biden being the front man on calling Trump a convicted felon all the time. One is that it does underline the perception that this was Biden's case and that Biden was the one who promoted it, which isn't true. And the other is that it could get overturned on appeal, and then that would be a very, very bad look. So, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's risky. Definitely, I think that I understand the impetus, particularly of people who feel very frustrated by Donald Trump, to want to hear it more often. Like, I get that. I think you're absolutely right, though, that the Biden campaign is torn between all sorts of different competing demands. They want to see him above the fray to an extent. They want to also, of course, undercut Donald Trump when they can. They want to also respect the elements on the left who are frustrated with even using the term convicted felon. There was a piece in the Washington Post today, opinion section, taking issue with that. But I will note one, I think, under-recognized aspect to it. We are all politics nerds. We track this stuff very closely. There's a poll that came out yesterday from 19th News that was conducted by SurveyMonkey, and they asked if people had heard of the verdict prior to being surveyed by the pollster. A third of independents said they hadn't, which is stunning, right? Like, how have you, where the hell do you live? Like, what are you doing with your life that you somehow avoided this, right? But they did, right? And from that standpoint, it is incumbent upon someone in the Biden campaign, it doesn't have to be Joe Biden, but to make sure people are cognizant of this. I agree that I don't think this, I think a lot of this is really baked in. I think that, the perceptions of Donald Trump are baked in, and I think that the campaign is going to be about what happens from January 20th, 2025 moving forward. But that said, I still think that voters should go to the polls with the awareness that whether or not it's overturned on appeal, that 12 jurors in the city of New York said that this guy was guilty of 34 felonies. That is obviously information that voters ought to have, and a surprising number at this point, though.
Right, but it would be better coming out of the mouths of surrogates or ads or something.
He's going to have $1 billion for his campaign. He can, there are lots of ways to do that where it's
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Damon, what about the question of prison? I thought this was a preposterous idea when it was first floated, actually before the trial even began, but since the verdict, there have been a number of very serious pieces saying, oh, yes, he should definitely do prison time for this. I'm dubious, to put it mildly. What's your sense?
Well, the judge seems like the kind of guy who might do it. I think it would be catastrophically stupid if he did that. I mean, I have a lot of contempt for the legal pundits who have I'm now probably going to antagonize potentially a few listeners and maybe even some people on this podcast by saying it. But there's been a legal fantasy for years that we're going to get this guy. We're going to throw him in jail, make him pay. He's guilty. It's an injustice. We got to get him. And that is still in operation among a lot of people. And there is a fantasy that we're going to put him in an orange jumpsuit and jump up and down and cheer. And I think that would be a horrible mistake. I mean, I would want to talk to Sasha again after that happens to see what the online extremism and even maybe real world extremism looks like in the week following such a thing. I think that would be a catastrophic error. Now, it would be very different, I should say, if say the Jack Smith case about January 6th had gone to trial, he had been convicted and then sentenced to jail time for that.
Yes.
That would have been terrible too in terms of like potential civic unrest. But in that case, the stakes would have justified the consequences.
Well, and the seriousness of the crime.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean by the stakes.
I
mean, then we're talking about a guy who did attempt a self-coup, and it's the first time someone has thwarted or attempted to thwart the peaceful transfer of power. This is a really big deal. this triviality about bookkeeping entries over the porn star story that we've heard about already for 8 years. Come on, give me a break. Nobody, here's a case where the sui generis comment really applies. Like, no other defendant in this kind of a guilty case would be thrown in jail. I mean, this is already an amped up transformation of a misdemeanor into a felony through a little bit of ledger domain and so forth. So like the idea that we're then going to treat it like a real felony in intent and punish it like a felony, I think would be a huge, huge overreach. And I have my fingers crossed, both of them, that the judge isn't foolish enough to do that. And the last thing I'll say about this is you want to see the Supreme Court do a kind of over-the-top intervention in this, which would then stir the pot and make everything even more polarized in another direction. This could do it. I mean, I could imagine the Supreme Court trying to figure out a way. John Roberts, like, wait a minute, this is, I don't know what it would be legally and constitutionally, but like somehow this is interference in the operation of a federal election, and this can't be permitted. And like, think of the mess that would create.
Okay. Anybody beg to differ?
No, I beg to agree, but I beg to differ with one thing Damon said, and that is he thought that Judge Juan Merchan might actually do this. I don't think he would do it. He might do something more than fines with, some sort of, I don't know, home arrest or for
community
a few days
service
on only, but only on the contempt charges. I think he deserves something more than $1,000 a day or $1,000 an incident fine on that. But I agree with Damon. It's not going to happen, though. I don't think Juan Merchan is going to give him jail time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think that there's an interesting possibility here, which is that Governor Hochul commutes any sort of punishment he gets, which I think would be fascinating. I think she has indicated her, in recent days that she is, trying to walk a very middle ground as things move forward. And it wouldn't really surprise me, especially if he got sentenced to jail. I think she commutes a sentence. The Democrats score a win with certain people in that regard, frustrate a lot of the base, but Hochul's already frustrating them. I think that's a possibility.
Whoa, that's interesting. I had not heard about that. That's quite the wrinkle. She is, of course, a Democrat. So interesting. All right. Sasha, did you want to add anything on the prison issue or?
I have nothing to add. I mean, I think that the kinds of threats, though, that we're seeing against, Judge Merchan and jurors and so on are really worrying and can lead, to nasty stuff and better protection. And as you said, when you open Mona, civil discourse.
Yes.
So to somehow get back to that, because this stuff can be extremely dangerous.
Yeah. All right. Well, speaking of incivility, I wanted to spend just a few minutes at the end here discussing the sort of clownish hearing that was held this week about the origins of COVID. This is so depressing about where we've become as a country, because a mature polity, having experienced a pandemic, would look back and look at lessons learned. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? How best should we prepare for the inevitable next pandemic, whenever it will hit? Let's be honest, some of us on the left maybe kept schools closed for too long. Let's be honest, on the right, we undermined confidence in vaccines, but no. The hearing that featured Anthony Fauci this week was a clown show. And you had them saying that not just that Fauci might have, might be criticized for giving conflicting advice. He said, don't mask. Then he said, do mask. No. They are saying that Fauci is responsible for the pandemic, that he funded the research in China that caused the pandemic, and then he covered it up. And it was just a, full bore attack on his character. And this is a person who, lifelong public servant, could have made, I'm sure, more money. Oh, he did fine, but he could have made a lot more money as a doctor in private practice. And he can't go anywhere now without burly security guards because of the kinds of things that are being said about him by the likes of Michael Cloud. I mean, it isn't just Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's, it's all of them. Philip, any comments?
I could do an hour of comments, but I mean, Fauci was the face of the administration's response when the response was sober and practical, and then Donald Trump wanted to jettison that response, and so he jettisoned Fauci. And so that then overlaps with two trends that we're seeing on Capitol Hill. The first being that an increasing willingness to elect people who have not only no experience in legislation and comedy, but no interest in it. And that then overlaps too with the fact that these hearings are used, since you can't record from the floor of the House and, present yourself as a serious legislator in that way. They use these hearings to do it. And so it gives this veneer of seriousness to people and a veneer of seriousness to the claims that they're making, which then get picked up by Fox News and the rest of the right-wing ecosystem. And so you have this guy who's a scapegoat who is targeted by people who don't know what they're talking about in a space that they exploit because it looks like they do know what they're talking about. And here we are.
Yeah. So Damon, there was a good moment. This Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis from New York made the most elementary mistake. I mean, obviously she never went to law school or maybe she did, but she didn't learn much because she asked a question to which she did not know the answer. So she said, Dr. Fauci, did you profit from the COVID pandemic? Did you make a profit from and he said, no.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I mean, the only thing I have to add to this discussion of this sorry episode this week is to just read a number. That number is 1,130,662. That's the number of Americans as of the end of April who died of COVID. That is the only scandal involved in this entire episode. And the fact that the Republican Party does not appear to give two SHITs about that and only wants to talk about Fauci and masks and 6 feet distances and the fact that there were mistakes, yes, by public health people. They went too far sometimes. They acted with more certainty than they really possessed. Those are all things that should be examined so that we do better next time. But the fact of the matter is Donald Trump was president and a lot of those people died on his watch. And I'm not even one to jump up and, accuse Trump personally of responsibility. I mean, I think a lot of those people would have died no matter who was president then. But that's what the pandemic was. It was 1,100,000 something human beings dying of this disease. And we should be trying to learn from what we did right, what we did wrong, and to do better. And instead, it's just theatrics, which is really all that exists for politics when it comes to the GOP now.
Linda, there has been a great forgetting about what happened under Trump's leadership with COVID. The conventional wisdom has sort of settled that the big mistakes involved shutdowns or masking requirements or, mandates to get vaccinated instead of the complete horrible, catastrophe of Trump's ineptitude in the face of this crisis. I mean, he lied and misled the public for a very long time, pretty much the entire year of 2020, about what we were up against. He mangled the federal response. He didn't ensure that testing was possible. In fact, he discouraged testing. I mean, you can go through the whole list, and the only thing he did was to ban travel. And he did get behind Operation Warp Speed. So good Good for that. But in terms of everything else, in terms of endorsing quack cures, in terms of, discouraging good civic hygiene, all of that, he was a catastrophe. And how is it possible that story has now been forgotten?
Well, it's possible it's been forgotten because his base, the people who in fact listened to him, were the ones who were taking ivermectin. They were the ones who were resisting vaccines. I do think that the administration should get credit for Warp Speed, and I think that was a tremendous success. The problem is that once the vaccines were available, there was a kind of disinformation campaign that was discouraging people from actually getting the shots. And that continues to this day. And ironically, it extends way beyond COVID shots. We now have an anti-vaccine movement unlike anything that any of us have ever seen. I am thankful that I don't have children in school anymore. I do have one grandchild left still in public school. And the idea that public schools are now having a hard time convincing parents to get their kids, vaccinated against common childhood diseases, measles, polio, all of these things. This is a tremendous change in America, and it is a very dangerous one. And I will say, even going back to Damon's point about the more than 1 million people who have died from COVID, there have been a number of studies that have looked at where those people have died. And it is ironically in the Republican counties of America where there is a much higher death rate. And that is absolutely attributable to the Republicans and their campaign against vaccines. And I venture to say that if we see this kind of anti-vaccine movement continue, that you're going to see another generation of children of Republicans who are not going to get vaccinated and may end up with diseases like polio. I was young enough that, I was around when the first polio vaccines became available. And not ironically, but the fact is I was very poor. My parents didn't take me to the doctor regularly. I didn't have those childhood vaccines. And as a result, I did get polio vaccine later in life. But as a result, doctors who have looked at my skeletal system say that I probably had a mild case of polio when I was younger. As a result, I hate to see that may happen again. And the Republicans are really going to bear the responsibility for this.
Can I just pick up on Linda's point? Because it's such an important one. I mean, what we saw during COVID, during the pandemic, was this absolutely enormous uptick in conspiracism writ large. And with that, a kind of opening up, a transformation of the online threat ecosystem, opening up new audiences to wider conspiracy networks of all sorts, as well as to extremist groups and hostile state actor manipulation. And they were all piling in during this period. And we saw the volume of that kind of conspiracist engagement massively grow, but also connect the dots across groups and constituencies that otherwise really never would have seen common cause. And you started to see, some of these anti-vax constituencies really being drawn into some fairly extreme spaces, and that start to play out in the real world with all sorts of, manifestations, protests, other things. You have these really strange bedfellows starting to, come together around specific common interests in the real world. So, and that hasn't gone away. Just the volume of conspiracism hasn't gone away. And that is the same constituency that these hostile states that I was talking about earlier are leveraging.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would just want to close this topic by observing that if you had been asked, say in 2018, or in 2010, let's say, if you'd been asked, how would the United States, one of the richest country in the world, most developed, with the most advanced infrastructure and rule of law and all the rest, how would the United States fare when it came to a pandemic vis-a-vis other countries similarly situated? You would have thought, well, we would have a lower death rate than other countries. I mean, perhaps leaving aside that we do have a lot of obese people, but even still, considering everything, we should have been incredibly well prepared to handle an emergency. And yet we had a higher death rate than peer countries, significantly higher. And that was due, I suggest, to poor leadership. It was really a matter of that we just had terrible leadership during that moment. And so hundreds of thousands of Americans died who did not need to, even in the presence of a new pathogen. So it's very, very important to remember that as people are thinking about whether, what the stakes are in voting in November. Donald Trump was tested at a time of a national emergency and very much found wanting. Okay, let us now turn to our highlight or lowlight of the week, and we'll start with Philip Bump.
The highlight of my week was actually last week, but that Salem Media Group, which is the distributor of Dinesh D'Souza's movie 2000 Mules, very quietly, in the face of a defamation lawsuit from one of the people in the movie, stopped streaming it, pulled it down, basically disavowed it. Wildly overdue. The movie was absolute garbage from the outset, just full of nonsense. It was debunked before it was even publicly available by myself and others. It did an enormous amount of damage. A lot of people, Trump included, although his is obviously self-serving, still claim that this occurred, that these people are dropping his ballot. Just one of the worst pieces of misinformation in the political sphere that I've ever seen. Sat out there for 2 years, but finally, at least there was some retribution that was affected on it, and that is objectively good news.
Absolutely. And they actually defamed particular individual Americans who sued.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly. A guy named Mark Andrews in Georgia in particular. Yeah.
Okay, Linda Chavez.
Well, we had a very important announcement this week by President Biden, and that was that he is now instituting new rules having to do with whether or not people who cross the border without documentation will be admitted and processed in their claims for asylum processed. He's essentially said that he's going to close down the border. This happens, by the way, at a time that border crossings had actually been down for the last 3 months in a row. Still high historically, but low. But I want to point out an article.
You mean lower, yeah.
Lower, yeah. I want to point out an article that appeared in the Washington Post this time that puts a kind of human face on this issue, because so often we think about these migrants and we talk about them as if they're just numbers. And there was an article today that really puts both a human face on the migrants themselves, but also on what the state of Texas is doing, which is unconscionable in my view. The article was in the Washington Post. It was titled, "This Catholic Leader Shelters Migrants. Texas Says He Runs Stash Houses." And it describes a man named Ruben Garcia who has devoted his life to helping migrants who cross into the United States. He's from El Paso, which is, right there on the border, and has been the recipient of so many tens of thousands of the people crossing in. And he runs something called Annunciation House. And apparently Texas is now going to prosecute him based on the new law that they passed. But he talks about two individuals who were actually let into the country legally on humanitarian parole after they had been attacked. One of them was a victim of a fire that occurred when he was being detained in the stay in Mexico policy in a detention center there that caught fire, horribly, horribly injured. The other was a Guatemalan woman who tried to cross in and was attacked, beaten, ended up losing her leg, and she also was let in under humanitarian parole. These are the kind of people that many of these charitable institutions, many of them run by the Catholic Church, take care of. And you have Governor Abbott going in and accusing these people as if they were somehow the dregs of society. And it's just heartbreaking. And I just recommend reading it. It's a long article, but I recommend reading it.
Thank you. Damon Linker.
Today, I want to give a plug to an essay by my former teacher and friend, longtime friend, Mark Lilla, who teaches at Columbia University. He has a new essay out in the New York Review of Books titled "The Tower and the Sewer." It is a very, if you know Lilla's work at all, you won't be surprised to hear it's a very erudite, elegant essay that focuses on a number of so-called post-liberal thinkers, including some of our favorites around here, Patrick Deneen, Sohrab Ahmari, and Adrian Vermeule. And it's just a fabulous piece. It's both very, at times, harshly critical of them, but he also has some nice things to say about Deneen's previous book before his more recent one, and about Ahmari's memoir. He finds some interesting things in those items to talk about. It also hits them quite hard where they deserve to be. But it's really, I think, valuable for its broader take on how we understand the intellectual right and the right approach to take to them that includes, I think, a lot of humanistic generosity combined with a critical edge about the mistakes these people are making, with potentially quite dire consequences. So if you're interested at all in the kind of high idea side of the things we talk about on this podcast, I very strongly recommend this essay to you. Again, it's at the New York Review of Books titled "The Tower and the Sewer." Unfortunately, it's behind a paywall at the moment, but from what I hear, you can, if you're not a subscriber, maybe you should become one. But if you're not willing to do that, I think if you give them your email, they'll give you a freebie so you can read it that way. So that's my recommendation.
Great. Thanks for the tip. I look forward to that. Sasha Havlicek.
I've been really moved watching the coverage of D-Day, and in a way, it sort of feels very relevant to the work that we do today, but it is a reminder of the absolutely critical role that the US has played in combating authoritarianism and around the world, and how terribly important it is for the whole world that the US resists, I suppose, those tendencies both at home and abroad, and remains a real defender of all of that. And it feels very personal in some way to me, having had my mother's side of the family fled Nazi Austria just before the war, and my father's side of the family from being from Eastern Europe and having, of course, lived through authoritarianism and fled those regimes, and having myself spent time working on the sort of transition from those authoritarian environments, how vital it is. And even just, understanding the role that the US played, in Yugoslavia, which is where my father's from, the absolutely critical role of the United States. And so reminded of that in a very, very emotional way by all these extraordinary heroes that we've heard from today, and hope very much that inspires ultimately the future direction of America.
Thank you. I have to say that the image that I saw, that I suggest people find online of Volodymyr Zelensky greeting an elderly, veteran hero in a wheelchair, where one is saying, "You're the hero." No, you're the hero. I mean, it was so moving. And anyway, so I highly recommend that. I would also like to recommend, as a highlight, an essay that appeared in the Bulwark this week by my very own son, Ben Parker. It is in honor of D-Day. It's called "The Biggest War on the Small Screen." And he talks about 3 series that address the war. Two of them he has very good things to say, the Band of Brothers and the Pacific. He had fewer nice things to say about Masters of the Air, which is full of flaws. In fact, I only watched a piece of it. But it's a really good essay where he makes the case that one of the things that is so great about Band of Brothers, for example, is their incredible fastidiousness about getting the history right. That was part of the tribute to these people, was that they were so careful to get the details. And he mentions that they had armbands, which is never explained in the storyline in Band of Brothers, but they were chemical weapons detectors that apparently the infantry did wear. I guess they would change color or something if they were exposed. But in any event, they just put those on the soldiers, but didn't even explain it. It was just, there was that much research that had gone into getting the details right. So anyway, I found that very interesting. And of course, I've watched The Pacific and Band of Brothers and can highly recommend both. In fact, I'm going to go back and watch Band of Brothers again because it was really one of the best things I've ever seen. And my son quotes somebody, a general or somebody, who said that it was the best depiction of combat, most realistic that they had ever seen. So with that, I would like to thank our guest, Sasha Havlicek, and thanks to Philip Bump for sitting in for Bill Galston this week, and of course to my regulars and our producer, Jim Swift. And I also, of course, want to thank our viewers and listeners, and Beg to Differ will return next week, as every week.